You are lying back, eyes gently closed, perhaps in a quiet room, perhaps in your bed. The story you are about to hear is not fast, not dramatic, not urgent. It is slow, it is steady. It is designed to drift with you, to move with the pace of calm breathing, to guide you through history in a way that lets your mind wander where it will. If you fall asleep, that is fine. If you dream, that too is fine. This is the boring history for sleep. Tonight, we are traveling back across oceans and continents, across centuries of memory, into the great walled city of Beijing, the Forbidden City, where, behind carved gates and golden roofs, one woman held extraordinary power. Her name was Cixi. She has been called many things: a schemer, a tyrant, a protector of tradition, a mother of emperors. But in this telling, she is not rushing, not shouting. She is simply another figure from the long, quiet history of the world. And tonight, we will trace her life as gently as one traces the lines on a folded map. So let us begin, not in the grand palace itself, but far away, in the quieter reaches of China, where she was born. Cixi's birth name was Yehanara Qing. She was born in the year 1835, during the reign of the Daoguang Emperor. The world she entered was still, in some ways, an ancient one. Horsemen rode across the plains of Manchuria. Farmers bent low over rice paddies, their work unchanged for centuries. The imperial court in Beijing moved slowly through the seasons, with rituals tied to the turning of the year. And in this world, a girl from a Manchu family was born, not yet destined to rule, not yet known to history. The Yehanara clan was part of the Manchu nobility, not the highest tier, not the emperors themselves, but respectable, with traditions stretching back to the founding of the Qing dynasty. Cixi's father was a man of middling rank, serving in the bureaucracy. He was not fabulously wealthy, nor especially powerful. His family lived with modest dignity, enough to sustain their status, but not enough to attract envy. As a child, little Xingzhen would have grown up in a household where Manchu customs blended with Han Chinese traditions. Her world was one of embroidered garments, careful etiquette, and a sense that every gesture had meaning. She may have been taught to read and write more than most girls, for the Manchu elite valued literacy, especially for those who might one day serve the dynasty in some way. She learned the characters of classical Chinese. She listened to poetry, and she absorbed, quietly, the rhythm of courtly life, even before she ever saw the palace itself. But for all her refinement, her childhood was not one of luxury. China in the 1830s and 1840s was a country under pressure. The Qing dynasty was beginning to feel the strain of a changing world. Western traders, especially the British, were demanding access to markets. The opium trade was growing, and soon the First Opium War would break out. All of this little Xingzhen would have heard about only faintly, as murmurs in the background of her youth. She was not yet an Empress Dowager, not yet a political force. She was a girl in a household of women, servants, and books, hearing stories of emperors long gone, their victories and their rituals. As she grew older, her family's hopes for her became clearer. In Manchu households, girls could sometimes be chosen to enter the Forbidden City as consorts. It was both an honor and a burden. To be chosen meant security, but also a lifetime behind palace walls. To be chosen meant rising high or vanishing in obscurity. And when Xingzhen reached her mid-teens, her path was set in 1852. At the age of 17, she was selected to enter the Forbidden City as a concubine to the young Emperor Xianfeng. The selection process was formal, ritualized, and exacting. Girls from noble Manchu families were presented, assessed for their grace, their poise, their lineage. Xingzhen, with her alert eyes and composed manner, was chosen. She was given a new title, as was customary, to step through the massive red gates of the Forbidden City, to see the tiled roofs stretch in golden lines across the horizon, to walk into courtyards filled with silence, where every sound of footsteps echoed off stone, to enter a world where everything was dictated by ritual, where even the way one bowed or spoke could change the course of a life. Cixi, as history would later call her, was now a woman of the inner court. Her childhood was over. Her new life, one of waiting, of maneuvering, of observing quietly, had begun. As the lamps were lit in the palace corridors, as eunuchs hurried past with messages, as other concubines whispered in their chambers, Cixi began the long, patient journey that would one day make her one of the most powerful figures in all of China. In the stillness of these palace halls, where silence was as important as words, Cixi waited. Her story, in these early years, was not of battles or decrees, but of careful survival. In the next part of our tale, we will wander further into the Forbidden City, and watch how this quiet consort, once just one among many, began to rise. Inside the Forbidden City, life unfolded according to an ancient rhythm. The emperor's days were shaped by ritual, morning audiences, offerings at shrines, discussions with officials, reports delivered on scrolls. But beyond those public halls, behind carved screens and lacquered doors, was the hidden world of the inner court. Here, the women of the palace lived, each watched, each waiting for favor. I entered this world in 1852 as a low-ranking consort. Her official title was Noble Lady Lan, one of many young women selected to serve Emperor Xianfeng. She was not the highest, she was not the lowest. She was one face among many, one voice among a quiet sea of whispers. The life of a concubine was both sheltered and restricted. Every action was prescribed. Meals were taken according to schedule. Clothing was chosen according to rank. The women moved within courtyards and chambers, rarely beyond the walls, and always under the gaze of eunuchs and senior attendants. And yet, within this constrained world, subtle games of influence unfolded. Friendships mattered. Alliances mattered. Most of all, the emperor's attention mattered. Cixi was observant. She did not rush, nor demand, nor throw herself forward. Instead, she watched. She learned the hierarchies of the palace. She understood which women were favored, which were fading, which eunuchs carried whispers worth hearing. And slowly, quietly, she positioned herself. One advantage she had was her literacy. Unlike many consorts, Cixi could read and write Chinese fluently, and she could write in both the Manchu and Chinese scripts. She began to assist the emperor with paperwork, preparing documents, helping with translations, even suggesting phrasing for decrees. This small skill set her apart. Xianfeng valued her ability, and he began to call on her more often. Another advantage was her son. In 1856, after 4 years in the palace, Cixi gave birth to a boy. This child would become the future Tongzi emperor. In the rigid world of the palace, to bear a son was the greatest step toward power. Other consorts faded into the background. Cixi now had a living bond to the dynasty itself, but her rise was not without caution. The emperor's principal wife, Empress Zuan, held the highest title. She, too, bore no son, but she commanded rank, dignity, and the loyalty of officials. Cixi could not outshine her openly. Instead, she worked quietly, gathering influence through her child, through her literacy, through her composure. Outside the forbidden city, storms gathered. The empire was under strain. The Second Opium War began in 1856, the very year of Cixi's son's birth. Foreign troops pressed on Chinese ports, demanding concessions. Within the empire, the Taiping Rebellion raged, one of the largest uprisings in human history, shaking provinces and devastating lives. While Cixi's world was confined to palace courtyards, the echoes of war carried even there. The emperor grew weary, anxious, often ill. The court was unsettled, and in such unsettled times, the role of the inner court grew heavier. Cixi's intelligence was noticed by more than the emperor. Senior officials, aware that she had the emperor's ear, began to see her as a quiet channel of communication. A suggestion carried by her could reach the throne more gently than a formal memorial. And so she became a kind of informal advisor, still cloaked in the appearance of a concubine, yet already moving pieces on the great board of empire. The years passed. The emperor grew weaker, his health declining. By the late 1850s and early 1860s, whispers spread that he might not live long. His court was troubled by wars and debts. His palace was troubled by rivalries. And in the midst of this uncertainty, the question of succession arose. Cixi's young son was the heir apparent. Still a child, still dependent, but the only son of the emperor. If Shan Feng were to die, the boy would become emperor. But a child emperor meant regents, and regents meant power struggles. Cixi understood this. She was no longer only a concubine, no longer only a mother. She was on the edge of becoming something larger, something more dangerous, something history would not forget. In 1861, Emperor Shan Feng died, far from Beijing. At the summer retreat of Ri, he left behind a 5-year-old heir and a court full of tension. On his deathbed, he named 8 senior officials as regents to guide the young boy. Among them was Suxian, a powerful minister with little sympathy for the Empress Dowager or for Cixi. But Xian Feng had also granted titles to his widow, Empress Zun, now known as Empress Dowager Cixi, and to Cixi herself, now Empress Dowager Cixi. Together, they held the ceremonial authority of mothers of the emperor. Together, they could, in theory, balance the regents. This fragile balance did not last. Within months of the emperor's death, Cixi and her allies staged what history calls the Xinyu coup. It was not loud. It was not bloody. It was a matter of alliances, of signatures, of commands issued in the name of the child emperor. The regents were accused of overstepping their power. They were arrested, and some were executed. And the 2 Empress Dowagers, Xian and Cixi, emerged as the regents instead. For the first time, Cixi held real power, not as a consort waiting in the shadows, not as a concubine seeking favor, but as one of the guardians of the throne, speaking in the name of the boy who would be Emperor So, the quiet girl from the Yehenara family. Once a low-ranking consort had risen. She now sat behind the throne, ruling in the name of her son. Her influence was no longer whispered, no longer hidden. It was written into the very structure of the court. The Forbidden City in the 1860s was a world of corridors, carved gates, and quiet courtyards. The great marble walkways still gleamed with ritual processions. The throne hall still hosted grand ceremonies. But behind those public displays, much of the empire's real direction now rested in quieter rooms. In those rooms, two women sat: Empress Dowager Cixi, the widow of the late emperor, and Empress Dowager Cixi, the mother of the young boy who was now emperor. Together, they were known as the two dowagers. In theory, they shared responsibility. In practice, balance was delicate. Cixi was dignified, calm, cautious. Cixi was sharper, more energetic, more willing to involve herself in daily matters of governance. Gradually, though always respectfully, she became the stronger of the two. The child emperor Tongzi was only 5 years old when his father died, too young to rule, too young to even grasp the weight of the ceremonies he performed. He was sheltered by layers of attendants and rituals. It was Cixi who spoke in his name. Her voice was not loud in public halls, but written in the edicts that passed across desks, sealed with the great imperial mark. The Qing dynasty was under great pressure in these years. The Taiping rebellion still raged in southern China, threatening to unseat the dynasty itself. Foreign powers, especially Britain and France, pressed for more concessions after the Opium Wars. The treasury was strained, the military weakened, and officials were wary. For the Qing to survive, decisions had to be made carefully, step by step. Like crossing a frozen river, Cixi's style of rule was not one of sweeping reform, not in these early years. It was cautious, conservative, attentive to stability above all. She listened to memorials from officials, weighed their words, and chose the paths that preserved the dynasty's dignity, while conceding just enough to foreign powers to avoid catastrophe. Some called this weakness. Others called it prudence. For Cixi, it was survival. Each day in the palace followed its rhythm. At dawn, memorials written by officials across the empire arrived, carried by couriers, unrolled by attendants. They contained reports on floods, on harvests, on military campaigns. Cixi would review them with advisors, sometimes late into the night, discussing which to approve, which to amend, which to send back with questions. She developed a reputation for attention to detail, for catching inconsistencies, for noticing when a phrase concealed hesitation or ambition. It is easy to imagine her in those dimly lit chambers, seated with scrolls spread before her, a brush in hand, candlelight flickering across lacquered wood. Around her, eunuchs waited silently, ready to carry her instructions outward into the machinery of empire. Each brushstroke she made on a memorial was a quiet act of power, binding distant provinces to the center. The rebellions were eventually suppressed, thanks in part to regional leaders such as Zheng Gofan and Li Hongzhang, who raised modernized armies. Cixi did not ride into battle, of course, but she authorized their actions, supported their campaigns, and rewarded them carefully. She knew that generals with too much success could become rivals. Balancing their power became part of her long game of survival within the Forbidden City. Cixi's influence was also visible in subtler ways. Appointments to court posts often passed through her approval. Eunuchs loyal to her found themselves in important positions. Her household became a center of quiet authority, where officials might seek favor or clarity before presenting matters in formal court. Even foreign envoys, limited in their access to the court, began to sense that behind the throne of the child emperor, this woman's will was decisive. Her partnership with Empress Dowager Cixi continued through the 1860s. The two appeared together in ceremonies, sat side by side in councils, and were addressed with equal reverence. But slowly, Cixi's caution left space for Cixi's firmer hand. When disagreements arose, it was often Cixi's position that prevailed, not through open confrontation, but through persistence, energy, and her careful network of allies. The young Tongzi emperor grew, but he did not grow into strength. As he entered his teenage years, he struggled with the weight of expectation. He preferred pleasures to governance, distractions to diligence. Cixi worried. Her son, whom she had worked so hard to place on the throne, seemed less capable of sustaining the dynasty. She tried to guide him, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, but the gap between them widened. In 1873, when Tongzi reached maturity, the regency was formally ended. Cixi stepped back, at least in name, and the young emperor took direct control. But his reign was short and troubled. He was indecisive, prone to indulgence, and unable to match the abilities of the ministers who surrounded him. Tension grew between mother and son. She, experienced in governance, could see what he could not. He, young and restless, resisted her guidance. Only 2 years later, in 1875, Tongzi died suddenly, at the age of 19. The official cause was smallpox, though rumors swirled of other illnesses. His death left the dynasty without a clear heir. No son survived him. The throne stood vacant. Here, once again, Cixi moved carefully but decisively. Together with Empress Dowager Cixi, she chose the next emperor, a child from another branch of the Imperial family, her young nephew, who would become the Guangxu emperor. Once again, a boy was placed on the throne, and once again the Empress Dowagers stepped forward as regents. This moment cemented Cixi's role. By guiding the choice of the new emperor, she ensured that her influence would continue. Her authority was not an accident, not a passing phase. It was now built into the very structure of succession. As the 1870s unfolded, Cixi's reputation grew, both within China and abroad. She was no longer simply the mother of an emperor. She was the steady presence behind 2 emperors. The figure who had preserved the dynasty through rebellion, through foreign pressure, and through the uncertainties of succession. In the next part of our journey, we will walk more slowly through the daily life of the Forbidden City under her regency, what she saw, what she valued, and how she lived among the rituals and shadows of the palace she had come to dominate. The Forbidden City is a place of stone and silence. For more than 500 years, it stood at the heart of Beijing, its walls high, its gates painted in red, its roofs glazed with yellow tiles that gleamed in the sunlight. From above, it looked like an ordered maze, a grid of courtyards and halls, each one leading to another, until at last one reached the throne hall at the center. But for those who lived inside, The palace was not only a monument, it was a home, a cage, a stage, and a world all its own. Cixi spent most of her life within those walls. Day after day, year after year, she woke, walked, and worked in spaces built centuries before her birth. The city outside grew and changed. Foreigners arrived with railways and telegraphs. But within the palace, time seemed slower, bound by ritual and repetition. Each morning began early. Long before the sun rose, the palace stirred. Eunuchs moved quietly through the corridors, lighting lanterns, preparing documents, bringing trays of food. In her quarters, Cixi would rise with the dawn. She was attended by maids and eunuchs who helped her wash, dress, and prepare for the day. Her robes were chosen according to rank and occasion. Silks embroidered with dragons, phoenixes, or seasonal flowers, always precise, always respectful of tradition. Meals were elaborate but often restrained. The imperial kitchens prepared dozens of small dishes, from rice and vegetables to delicacies of fish and poultry. Yet Cixi, like many in the palace, ate selectively, preferring simple foods when she wished, and saving the grand banquets for ceremonies. To eat in the Forbidden City was to follow rules as much as to satisfy hunger. Each dish presented in a certain order, each flavor linked to the seasons. After breakfast, work began. Cixi's days as Empress Dowager were filled with the reading of memorials, the discussion of state affairs, and the careful balancing of officials' requests. Sometimes she sat behind a screen while ministers presented their cases, her presence half concealed but entirely felt. At other times, she worked in her private chambers, surrounded by scrolls and brushes, dipping her pen into ink as she marked replies. The palace itself shaped her rhythms. Its vast courtyards echoed with footsteps. Its gardens offered small moments of retreat, groves of cypress, ponds with lotus flowers, quiet pavilions where one could sit and breathe in the fragrance of pine. Cixi loved gardens. She often had flowers brought in, arranged in vases, placed where she could see them as she worked. Even in winter, when the courtyards were bare and the air sharp with cold, she surrounded herself with plants, as though to remind herself of the cycles beyond the palace walls. The Forbidden City was also a place of constant ritual. Every season brought ceremonies, offerings at ancestral shrines, sacrifices at temples, audiences with officials. Each ritual was timed with precision, carried out in strict order. Cixi, though not the emperor, was present for many of these events, her role both symbolic and practical. To appear was to remind all who attended that she was the guardian of the throne, the mother of emperors, the voice behind the curtain. Life in the palace could be quiet, but it was never empty. Hundreds of eunuchs served within its walls, managing everything from clothing to correspondence. They were the invisible machinery of the Forbidden City, moving silently through corridors, carrying trays of tea, preparing chambers for audiences. Cixi relied on them, but she also managed them with care. Too much power in one eunuch's hands could be dangerous. Too little trust could paralyze her household. She balanced their roles, rewarded loyalty, and watched closely for signs of ambition. Amid these routines, there were moments of private leisure. Cixi was said to enjoy painting, calligraphy, and poetry. She appreciated fine art, collected treasures, and sometimes arranged performances of opera within the palace. These were not only pleasures, but also ways of sustaining the cultural traditions that gave the dynasty its dignity. An opera staged in the palace courtyard was both entertainment and reminder, a living link to centuries of imperial culture. As the years passed, the Forbidden City became both sanctuary and prison. Cixi rarely left its walls. When she traveled, it was with great ceremony to the summer palace on the outskirts of Beijing, or to other imperial retreats. But most days, her world was bounded by those familiar courtyards. The outer world reached her through reports, envoys, and the distant sounds of change. But within, life remained a cycle of meals, memorials, rituals, and reflections. Imagine her, late at night, in her private chambers. The lamps burn low. The scrolls are stacked neatly on a desk. Outside, the courtyards lie silent, the great palace sleeping under the moonlight. She sits quietly, perhaps sipping tea, perhaps thinking of her youth, of the path that brought her here. Beyond the walls, an empire shifts and struggles. But within, for a moment, there is stillness. The silence of the Forbidden City holds her, as it has held generations before her, as it will hold generations after. This was the daily life of the palace, repetitive, ritualized, yet steady, a rhythm that shaped Cixi's decades of rule. But beyond those walls, the empire faced storms that no courtyard silence could keep away. In the next part of our story, we will drift outward to see how foreign powers pressed upon China, how the dynasty struggled to adapt, and how Cixi's hand-guided responses in an age of upheaval. The Forbidden City stood still, but the world beyond its walls did not. In the 19th century, China faced challenges unlike any in its long history. Foreign ships arrived at its coasts. Foreign soldiers marched into its ports. Foreign envoys demanded treaties, privileges, and concessions. For an empire that had long seen itself as the center of civilization, these intrusions were unsettling, almost unthinkable. Cixi lived through them all. From her position behind the throne, she saw China shift from a dynasty that expected tribute from others to a nation forced into unequal agreements with Western powers. Her reign was, in many ways, a long balancing act seeking to preserve dignity while giving ground when resistance meant disaster. The Opium Wars had already shaken the empire before Cixi rose to power. By the 1860s, after the Second Opium War, foreign embassies were established in Beijing itself. It was a startling change. Outsiders, once kept at a distance, now lived within reach of the Forbidden City. They walked in its streets. They negotiated directly with ministers. They pressed for more trade, more access, more rights. For Cixi, this was both a humiliation and a puzzle. She had not been raised to imagine Western powers as equals to the Qing dynasty. Yet here they were, with steamships, rifles, and new forms of wealth. To resist outright was dangerous. To yield completely was unthinkable. And so, she chose the middle path of concessions when necessary, but maintaining the rituals and language of imperial dignity as much as possible. Officials debated how to respond. Some argued for reform, urging that China adopt Western technology, modernize its armies, and send students abroad. Others clung to tradition, insisting that China's strength lay in its ancient ways. Cixi listened. She approved some reforms: new arsenals, new schools, even the sending of a small group of boys to study overseas. But she also resisted changes that seemed too fast, too foreign, too disruptive to the order she sought to preserve. As decades passed, the pressure did not ease. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out. Japan, once seen by many Chinese as a smaller neighbor, had modernized rapidly and successfully. Its armies and navy, trained in Western methods, overwhelmed Chinese forces. The loss was sharp, humiliating, and undeniable. China was forced to cede Taiwan and recognize Japan's influence over Korea. This defeat deepened the sense of crisis. Foreign powers now saw China as vulnerable, and they pressed harder. Spheres of influence were carved out. Railway rights, mining rights, and port rights were claimed by different nations. It was as if the empire were being divided piece by piece, each concession signed reluctantly, each treaty another weight upon the dynasty. Amid this growing pressure came the movement known as the Boxers. They were bands of peasants practicing martial arts and spiritual rituals, believing themselves protected from bullets, convinced that they could resist the foreign presence. Their slogan was simple: support the Qing, destroy the foreigners. They attacked missionaries, Chinese Christians, and foreign communities. Their anger was raw, fueled by years of poverty, drought, and resentment at foreign intrusion. At first, Cixi was cautious. She watched the movement grow. She weighed its potential. Could it be useful to push back against foreign pressure? Could it strengthen the dynasty's position by channeling popular anger? When the Boxers entered Beijing in 1900, she made her choice. She declared support for them, framing their uprising as a patriotic defense of the dynasty against outsiders. But the decision led to calamity. Foreign legations in Beijing were besieged. Foreign nations, including Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States, formed an alliance and sent troops to relieve their envoys. The Allied armies advanced quickly, overwhelming Chinese defenses, marching into Beijing itself. Cixi and the Guangxu emperor fled the city, disguised as ordinary travelers, retreating west to Xi'an for the Forbidden City. It was another humiliation. Foreign soldiers marching through its gates, occupying its halls, where emperors had once ruled in unmatched dignity. For Cixi, it was a bitter lesson. The Boxers, who had promised strength, had instead brought devastation. When peace was negotiated, the terms were severe. China was forced to pay enormous indemnities to allow foreign troops to remain stationed in Beijing and to accept restrictions that weighed heavily on its sovereignty. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 marked another moment of decline, another deep wound to the dynasty. And yet, even after this disaster, Cixi endured. She returned to Beijing, resumed her place in the Forbidden City, and continued to rule. Her resilience was remarkable. Many might have expected her to fall from power after such a failure, but she remained, adjusting once more, steering once more, preserving what she could. It is worth remembering that throughout these decades, the palace routines still continued. Even as treaties were signed and wars lost, the Forbidden City still held its rituals. The bells still rang for ceremonies. The officials still presented their memorials. The gardens still bloomed with lotus in summer and lay silent with snow in winter. Amid upheaval, the rhythm of palace life gave a sense of continuity, a reminder that even as the world shifted, The dynasty endured if only a little longer. Cixi had weathered rebellions, defeats, and foreign invasions. But she was more than just a political figure. She was also a woman with personal tastes, private interests, and moments of reflection. In the next part of our journey, we will step away from politics and linger on her personal side, her gardens, her art, her daily habits, and the myths that grew around her in life and in legend. History often remembers rulers only for their decrees, their wars, their treaties. But even the most powerful figures lived lives made of ordinary moments, meals eaten, gardens walked, books read, tea poured into porcelain cups. Cixi, the Empress Dowager, who guided an empire, was also a woman who valued beauty, who sought comfort, who surrounded herself with art and nature within the stillness of the palace. Among her greatest pleasures were gardens. Though the forbidden city itself was more stone than greenery, Cixi often retreated to the summer palace, a vast estate of lakes, pavilions, and landscaped hills just outside Beijing. Here she could walk among willows, drift in painted boats across Kunming Lake, and look upon the long covered corridor decorated with scenes of mountains, flowers, and stories from classical literature. The summer palace was more than retreat. It was renewal. Its gardens reflected the rhythms of the seasons. Lotus blossoms opened across the water in summer. Chrysanthemums brightened the paths in autumn. In winter, the frozen lake stretched silent under pale skies. To sit in a pavilion, sipping tea, watching the play of light on water, this was as much part of her life as the audiences and memorials of the Forbidden City. Cixi was also a patron of art. She appreciated opera, a beloved form of entertainment in Beijing. Performances were often arranged within the palace, with actors presenting tales of loyalty, betrayal, and devotion. The stylized gestures, the painted faces, the rhythm of drums and strings, all these were part of her evenings. Some accounts suggest she even directed the staging, offering her own preferences for costumes and storylines. She enjoyed painting and calligraphy. Brush and ink were tools of both relaxation and expression. Her works, though not always technically masterful, carried the elegance of someone steeped in tradition. To paint bamboo or plum blossoms was not only an artistic act, but a symbolic one. Bamboo for resilience, plum for endurance in winter, flowers for renewal. Through these images, she aligned herself with virtues admired for centuries. Clothing, too, expressed her tastes. As Empress Dowager, she wore robes of yellow, the imperial color, embroidered with dragons and phoenixes. But she was also fond of softer shades, blues, greens, and delicate floral designs. Her hair was arranged in the Manchu style, high and wide, adorned with ornaments of jade, pearls, and coral. To dress was not vanity alone. It was part of the language of rule, a way of embodying the dynasty's dignity. In her private life, she cultivated habits of refinement. She was said to be particular about food, favoring simple dishes of vegetables, fish, and rice. Though elaborate banquets were prepared for state occasions, tea was central. Fragrant brews served in porcelain cups, sometimes with floating flower petals, sometimes plain and clear. To sip tea in the quiet of the palace, perhaps while gazing at a scroll painting, was one of her enduring pleasures. And yet, around her, legends grew. Foreign envoys and journalists who caught glimpses of her often exaggerated their accounts. Some described her as extravagant, surrounded by luxuries, dining on endless delicacies, reclining in golden halls. Others painted her as severe, sharp-eyed, commanding even in silence. The truth, she could be both frugal and indulgent, both gentle and firm, depending on the moment. Rumors about her character circulated widely. Some said she was ruthless, willing to sacrifice anyone to keep power. Others said she was maternal, protective of the dynasty, even affectionate toward servants and attendants. In truth, she was a mixture, as most people are sometimes cold, sometimes kind, sometimes both at once. Visitors to the palace left with impressions that added to her legend. The sight of her surrounded by attendants, seated before screens of carved jade, created an image both awe-inspiring and mysterious. Few spoke with her directly, yet many carried away stories that magnified her presence. As she grew older, Cixi became increasingly conscious of how she was remembered. She commissioned portraits of herself, seated with dignity, wearing robes of rank, her expression calm, her gaze steady. These portraits were more than likenesses. They were statements. They declared, "Here is the mother of emperors, the guardian of tradition, the ruler who endured through storms." Even within her own lifetime, myth and reality blurred. Foreign newspapers often portrayed her as a despot, the dragon lady who ruled through cunning. Within China, some saw her as a stabilizing force, others as an obstacle to progress. She was both admired and criticized, both feared and respected, and through it all, she remained within her palaces, moving through gardens and corridors, shaping an empire while surrounded by art, ritual, and beauty. Imagine her, late in life, seated in the summer palace. The waters of the lake shimmer with reflected light. The breeze carries the sound of rustling willows. She sits in a pavilion, a brush in her hand, perhaps sketching flowers, perhaps simply watching the ripples. Around her, attendants wait quietly, ready to serve, yet not intruding on her moment of peace. For all her power, for all her controversies, she was still a woman who found solace in nature, in art, in the calm beauty of her chosen surroundings. Beyond the edicts and rebellions, beyond treaties and wars, there was this other side of Cixi, the lover of gardens, the patron of opera, the woman who painted bamboo and drank tea beneath carved eaves. But history does not rest only on private pleasures. In her final years, she still faced questions of succession, of reform, and of how the Qing dynasty would endure after her. In the next part of our story, we will linger on her legacy, how she shaped the empire's final decades, how she was remembered after her death, and how the myths of tyranny and guardianship intertwined around her name. As the 19th century faded into the 20th, the Qing dynasty faced storms it could no longer withstand. Railways, telegraphs, and foreign armies pressed into China, altering landscapes that had been stable for centuries. Reformers called for change, revolutionaries plotted in secret, and the dynasty that had once ruled with absolute authority felt the ground shifting beneath it. By now, in her 70s, had lived through nearly half a century of these changes. She had entered the Forbidden City as a young girl, barely noticed among the ranks of consorts. Now she was the most powerful figure in the empire, her word still shaping policy. her presence still commanding the attention of officials and princes in her later years. She showed signs of cautious reform. Schools were modernized. The examination system that had selected officials for centuries was finally abolished, and steps were taken to consider a constitutional government. Some said these reforms were too little, too late. Others said they were remarkable, given the resistance of tradition and the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. But time was catching up. The Guangxu emperor, whom she had once raised to the throne as a child, was frail and increasingly sidelined. The years of tension between him and Cixi had taken their toll, and though reforms were announced, the empire seemed caught between two directions, one looking to the past, one searching for the future. In 1908, both the emperor and Cixi reached their final days. The emperor died first, under circumstances that have long remained a subject of speculation. Whispers spread that he had been poisoned, perhaps to prevent him from reversing policies or punishing officials once Cixi was gone. The truth may never be fully known. What is certain is that only a single day after his death, Cixi herself passed away. Her death marked the end of an era. For nearly 5 decades, she had been the central figure in China's imperial politics, a woman who held power in a system that officially reserved it for men. Now, the throne was left to a child, the last emperor of China, a boy known as Pui, only 2 years old. Cixi's funeral was grand, befitting her station. The rituals of the Qing dynasty were followed, with processions, offerings, and ceremonies to honor the Empress Dowager, who had guided the empire through so many storms. She was laid to rest in the eastern Qing tombs, among emperors and empresses. Her spirit joined to the lineage she had so fiercely protected. Yet, even as incense burned in her honor, debate about her legacy began. To some, especially foreign observers of her time, she was a tyrant, a symbol of resistance to progress, the dragon lady who clung to power at any cost. They painted her as manipulative, extravagant, ruthless. Stories of her supposed cruelty circulated widely, becoming part of Western imaginations of imperial China. But within China, memories were more complex. Many officials, servants, and attendants remembered her as decisive, intelligent, even caring. She had, after all, preserved the dynasty during moments when it might have collapsed altogether. Without her, some argued, the empire would have fallen decades earlier. To others, however, she remained the face of conservatism, the one who delayed necessary reforms until it was too late. Historians have continued this debate. Was she the tyrant who suffocated progress, or the guardian who preserved stability? Was she selfish in her pursuit of power, or selfless in her devotion to the dynasty? The answers depend on where one looks and on what one chooses to believe. What is certain is that she embodied contradictions. She was both modern and traditional, both ruthless and protective, both admired and condemned. Her reign was a mirror of the empire itself in its final century, resilient, yet unable to resist the changes of a new world. Even today, her image continues to shift. In novels, films, and documentaries, she is sometimes the villain, sometimes the heroine, sometimes both at once. The term Dragon Lady, once used to diminish her, has been reconsidered by some as a sign of strength in a patriarchal world. She is remembered as a woman who wielded real authority. something rare in the long history of Chinese emperors and empresses. And so, as we close this long, quiet journey through her life, imagine the Forbidden City once more. The courtyards are still. The carved gates stand silent. A thin mist drifts through the palace roofs, where yellow tiles catch the dim light of dawn. Within these walls, Cixi once ruled, once dreamed, once painted, once walked among attendants and officials. Now her footsteps are gone, but her presence lingers in history, debated, reimagined, never forgotten. Her story is not a simple one of tyrant or savior. It is the story of a woman who lived in extraordinary times, who shaped an empire, and who left behind questions that still stir reflection today. Like the still waters of the palace pools, her memory reflects different images depending on where one stands. Sometimes dark, sometimes bright, always part of the larger landscape. And as you drift now, perhaps toward rest, you can let the details of her story fade gently, like echoes in the Forbidden City at dusk. The walls are quiet, the corridors long, the gardens calm. Cixi is gone, the dynasty is gone, but the stillness remains. And in that stillness, history becomes less about judgment and more about memory, soft, enduring, and endless. You have now walked through 2 hours of quiet history, through palaces and gardens, through struggles and triumphs, through myths and memories. Let the weight of the story settle lightly, like evening air. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine the long, silent corridors of the Forbidden City, stretching away into the calm of night. Here history rests, and so may you.